Uh, Hello, all, and welcome to our VODcast, The Fifth Industrial Revolution. My name is Rachin Kansal. I spent 20 years in healthcare, and I am now a professor at Seton Hall University and lead its Center for Leadership Development. I'm also the project director for the project, The Fifth Industrial Revolution, a graduate level course and an exploratory project that is exploring the intersection of life on planet Earth, life in space, and health technology. On planet Earth, our conditions keep evolving. On one hand, we have made multiple advances and we are in a much better place as a human species than we were even 100 years ago or 50 years ago. On the other, we are facing continued crisis in form of climate, pandemics, earthquakes like the one we had today in California, etc., etc. So is the fifth industrial revolution going to be continuing to improve human life on planet Earth? Is that what it's going to be? On the other hand, the other trend line is we are going into space. Every day in the newspaper, we are seeing a new news item about something new happening in space. We have flown a helicopter on Mars. We have reached the boundary of the solar system and entered interstellar space with Voyager 1 and 2. Wall Street is calling space the next trillion-dollar industry. So is the fifth industrial revolution going to be exploration of space? Or number three, if we think of space, human bodies are not really made up to survive in extraterrestrial environments. And we also said that the conditions on planet Earth, from climate perspective, etc., keep changing. So is the fifth industrial revolution will be about health technology enabling better human life, both on planet Earth in more extreme conditions and in space, extraterrestrial environments. Is that the fifth industrial revolution? So those really are the three questions that we're exploring as part of this project. And today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Paul Fonteyne on our show to talk about this. Assisting me today are also my two students, Anthony Pizzonia and Tillman Pitcher. And, we will basically have an informal discussion. We do have a few prepared questions, but we want to have an informal discussion on this topic. With that, Paul, it's my pleasure to welcome you. For our audience, Paul Fonteyne is the former CEO of Boehringer Ingelheim, where I also worked for some time. He is now a board member and investor in many biopharma companies and really gets to see the advances in health technology. So welcome, Paul, and why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Thank you, Ruchin, and nice to see you all. I have spent the last 30 to 35 years in the pharmaceutical industry, and in the last 2 or 3 years have spent more time with emerging biopharmaceutical companies and the people that invest their partners' monies in those companies in the form of private equity firms or venture capitalists. So what I bring to the table is both the perspective of someone who spent a lot of time in operating roles inside large established firms, and someone who's now in the governance structure of firms that are developing and at various stages of bringing new pharmaceutical options to the market.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction, Paul. And you do sit at a very unique place in the ecosystem where you are seeing a lot of what is happening. Last 18 months, we have seen the industry, health industry really, do very well. I mean, it's unheard of that within 9 months of hitting a pandemic, we had a vaccine solution. And that at this time, we have vaccinated major parts of at least the developed world, if not the developing world. We have also seen a lot of advances in the digital health space, which was just, a baby being born just 5 years ago. So broadly speaking, sitting where you are, what are some of the key advances that you see happening today?
So two fronts, and one is a tried and true model, which is your traditional biotech, biopharma play where a potential new mechanism is understood in a particular disease, and then a number of bright people get together and identify some biologics or small molecules that could drug that target, quote unquote, and provide for a beneficial effect. So that system is alive and well more than at any time in my career. Numbers of diseases that will at least have an option from a pharmaceutical perspective is growing by the day. And so I think that's a very healthy ecosystem. It will at some point bump up against resource constraints that we can get into, but the creativity, especially in and around the large academic centers in this country and a few other countries, is alive and well. Boston, Massachusetts is basically the epicenter of that industry worldwide, and is, as many of you I'm sure realize, has become a thriving metropolis as a result of, in large part, to healthcare discovery. There is, as you pointed out, Ruchin, an emergence of digital therapeutics in the form of either diagnostic or therapeutic tools. We're just at the beginning, not of development, but of commercialization of these options. And I think we might see fairly rapid progress on that, particularly when it comes to identifying critical childhood diseases and identifying them sooner than we have before. Because not only will physicians use their expertise and training, but they will be supplemented by devices that are powered by the expertise of many other physicians. AI capabilities that might render their diagnostic accuracy even greater and for sure faster. And the speed here is critical because some diseases like autism spectrum disorder, for example, can take 2 to 3 years to get to the right diagnosis. If that can be shrunk, therapy can be initiated sooner, and the child can have greater educational opportunities much sooner than if we let the medical system that we have take over and drag the decision as to what really is the problem with this child a little bit too long. And so I can see aided diagnostics. I can see the beginning of digital therapeutics in a variety of CNS disorders, so central nervous system disorders. That is starting to happen. And I've seen options for dementia and Alzheimer's patients. I've seen options for certain type of rare diseases of CNS origin. That is starting to blossom, and I think will continue. I think there's a market adoption for attention deficit disorder as well.
Yeah. No, that's a very good way of framing, where you see the industry, the traditional biopharma model and the emerging diagnostic.
I skipped over because you mentioned that the enormous win on COVID vaccines.
Yes.
Which is promising for other infectious diseases that with the same technology, because I think there's been far more publicity around that particular event.
Right, and then vaccination can potentially also, prevent a lot of these later stage diseases that happen. So
what has been disappointing in COVID, Ruchin, since that's on everyone's mind these days, is our ability to develop the therapeutics for those of us that get into serious medical situation with COVID as a result of a COVID infection. I would have banked the odds of having therapeutics much higher than what actually happened, and the odds of having an effective vaccine much lower than what, and it's actually the reverse that.
Reverse. Why do you say that?
First of all, I think the knee-jerk reaction of our colleagues has been to take existing compounds and throw them at this target. And that's been somewhat miserable failure. And the speed at which this virus is mutating will require options that can be cycled very frequently, which is pretty far away from the traditional therapeutic development model. So I think we got to look at the development model, and we got to try to anticipate how this virus is mutating and sort of develop a number of options to take on the mutants before they've even shown up. Now, that may or may not be a very good investment proposal.
Yes.
But it's what we might have to do.
Yeah. No, I mean, based on just this opening comment that you have made, my mind is going in a few different directions in terms of questions. You brought up this whole idea of, the motivation for innovation. You brought up this idea of, being truly innovative. You talked about this idea of, changing the development model that can keep pace with the nature of disease versus the old model. But before we get into some of those, the primary question I have is, you said you started in the industry 30 years ago. So from 30 years ago to today, if you can say these are the two things that you would call as the most innovative things that have happened, what are those two things that have happened over the last 30 years?
One tries to remember. The advent of genetic engineering overlaps with that 30-year period. And the first company that emerged from that, actually Biogen.
Yeah.
And then there were many others, Amgen, Genentech are the most famous ones that actually made it. Many others didn't make it. Yeah. And so that opened up a number of diseases that were very hard to target with basic chemistry. So the opening up of biology to that extent, if you step back 30 years, that spawned an entire industry onto itself. Yeah. And it's the other significant development in this lifetime is what we've been able to do with vaccine technology. And I leave even aside the recent developments with COVID, but I remember, and you probably do too, lots of children being affected by polio.
Polio, yeah.
And really debilitating conditions that would fundamentally increase infant mortality. And so when you look at the last 30 years and you look at the rapid increase in life expectancy, of course, a few of us have access to medicines that keep our cardiovascular system running a little bit longer.
Right.
But really, it comes from better infant care and lowering of infant mortality to a very significant extent, primarily in the developed economies. And so that whole advance is creating other constraints in our system, because it's clear that my children will have an expectation to live way past the life expectancy of my parents or even myself. And so that will create resource constraints that will have to be tackled.
Right. Yeah, and that only is exacerbated by the emergence of AI and other technologies, which are saying they could take away from the labor and work that humans do. So if you're living longer and if you're being displaced by technology, that almost creates a situation that politicians do not want to really talk about, at least not now, but will have to in the future. But you talked about genetic engineering, which has allowed us to really examine human bodies at the DNA level, and it is not out of the realm of imagination that we can tweak the gene to make us live longer, live better, live in different environments. And on the other hand, you talk about vaccination, which is preventative. All right. Now, let's advance 20 years from now, right? Do you see more focus on these kind of technologies that are focused on really adapting the human body? Or do you see more advances in the traditional medicine, which is curing the symptoms of the disease or just prolonging longevity by helping you breathe a little bit longer or do something a little bit longer?
I think everyone's trying to do both. The gene editing, where I remove the risk of one having a particular condition, we're very early on in that battle. It holds promise, but it is largely unproven. And there's only so many single gene diseases. And so I think that some people will definitely benefit from that short term. I think the real application on a preventive basis, if you will take another generation. And I think, therefore, finding ways to tackle a disease when it first manifests itself with a variety of modalities that will increase our ability to fight it off or to sustain life with it is still where the vast majority of the companies that I run into are putting their energy in and their investors' money.
Yeah. And what do you think is the motivation behind that? Is it the money that is to be made, or are there some noble outcomes that also drive the rate and nature of innovation?
It's always a combination of all of the above. At the beginning, there's the scientific ability to conquer a particular situation, disease situation. But in order to enable that, the nobility of the cause itself will not just suffice.
Yeah.
So you'll have to assemble a group of investors that are willing to risk it all from a money perspective to fund that particular effort. And sometimes the government is involved. I've done some work in the field of Alzheimer's, where industry has failed repeatedly and is getting a little gun shy to invest. And their government, in the form of NIH, has stepped in with massive funding to try to continue this quest, which is a horrible unmet need that in our generation, we've got to really try to make significant advances on. And so there have been sources of funding from private investors, but also from, in the case of the United States, where I'm most familiar, there have been significant investments made also where industry does not seem to be advancing as quickly as, for example, in oncology.
Right. So let's switch gears a little bit, right? And we started to get into it with the comment around NIH investing in spaces where the industry is a little bit gun shy, or the investors are a little bit gun shy. And we were looking at the discipline of telemedicine, and I'm sure The need for telemedicine arose from the need to serve rural patients and also to serve astronauts in space. And it was, in fact, Indian Health Services and NASA that launched a project in the 70s that accelerated the development of telemedicine technology and provided a lot of lessons in remote management, both in extreme environments and nearby but hard to reach environments. Uh, there is certainly some precedence of intersection of, space and health and the kind of innovations that it has led to. Uh, just wanted to see what was your reaction to the thesis I put forward up front. Do you think, as again, as an investor and an operator in the healthcare biopharma industry, what kind of trend lines do you see? Do you see a trend line, at least for the next 100 years, that's totally focused on making life better on Earth? Or do you see some divergence happening and, some divergence that starts to focus on this whole idea of space exploration and health technology being that, a pillar of innovation?
Right. So I'm obviously not an expert in anything that has to do with space. But I understand the needs of a population that will, because of what our industry has been able to do, continue to grow faster than it has grown in the past because of increased longevity and decreased infant mortality. And so the need to produce everything that will need to be produced to sustain all these lives is an interesting capacity model.
Yeah.
But where space can play an important role. So the decisions that would have to be made there is beyond the obvious of what's realistic to do outside of the surface of the Earth, is what can be what are the types of activities that we would rather outsource, quote unquote, to space, whatever that means. What does it mean another planet? Does it mean a man-made contraption that's sitting remotely? Those are interesting questions to create more capacity on Earth. And to the extent that the transfer costs back and forth keep coming down, can it be achieved for some high value type of products? Potentially. What are some of the most likely high value products? They might have to do with sustaining life on Earth. And so usually tech and biotech come to the top of that value proposition, if you will. So I wouldn't be, it may not be in my lifetime, but I wouldn't be surprised that decisions start to be made to create more space on Earth for certain types of activities that either we wouldn't want on Earth because of whatever harm they could cause, or that they just take so much space that you want to put them somewhere else. So for me, I'm an engineer by trade, and I look at it as a capacity model, and it's more space to be used for whatever activity could contribute to life on Earth, or could declutter life on Earth.
Yeah, no, this is a very interesting perspective that you just provided. The capacity constraint model and the fact that space may have to be the next frontier just because we have increased human longevity and reduced infant mortality, so we are living longer, and therefore we will have to find ways to serve our needs, and that means space becomes an extension of our life. That is very, very interesting. Now, in your travels, and you talked about academic medical centers, and you talked about some of the research institutions as well. Have you seen any health technologies that go beyond what we have just talked about, but that are more almost looking at creating the next version of human race where we start to be, a combination of how we are born and technology. And then, do you see that as well, or do you see most of the efforts today just still focused on keeping the human body the way it is, but tweaking it to live longer and better?
I mean, I'm going to exclude all the implantable devices and
Yes.
Because these are pretty mainstream already.
Right.
And I think you see versions of that in drug delivery a little bit. It's still at a pretty rudimentary stage. Think insulin pumps. Think other drug delivery devices that can be implanted. You have an industry that exists there that is helping a patient with a particular deficiency get through the day and get through it in a healthy way. So I think that will continue to be an adjacency to the production of the pharmaceuticals. The fact that some of them will have to be infused will continue to exist. Some of them have to be infused for extended periods of time. So I think these types of activities will exist. I haven't seen really successful options for quote unquote replacement parts, other than orthopedics, perhaps a little bit cardiology and vascular surgery, but it's not as mainstream as you would think. So I don't think that because medical devices and med tech, as opposed to biopharma, has been more consolidated than some of the other industries within healthcare. And I think there's 3 or 4 large providers that have done really well. But I don't see as much of I see a few, and we have a few in the investment firms I support, but the numbers are a lot lower than what you see in terms of developing new medicines. There are some interesting options going after big unmet needs, but they tend to be more on the exception rather than the rule in the traditional venture capital portfolio.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. Anthony and Tillman, any questions that come to your mind?
Yes, actually, I did want to ask a quick question, but before I do so, Paul, thank you very much for appearing on our podcast today. It means a whole lot, and you definitely gave us a lot to think about. But sort of transitioning a bit away from biopharma, this was one pressing question that I kind of had throughout the week as we were preparing to interview you. So in the healthcare world, cybersecurity is obviously paramount, right? Because you have a lot of sensitive information, whether that be patient health records, credit card information, social security numbers, and whatnot. And I was just wondering if you could speak to sort of any developments that you've seen made in that field, and maybe kind of what's next as it relates to cybersecurity and patient safety. Like, are companies really like aligning these initiatives and placing a great emphasis on that or not?
Again, my expertise is not really that strong on your question. So caveat, you're talking to someone who's not an expert, like some of the other things we discussed earlier. I think it is a huge threat, and the extent to which it is being addressed is not entirely clear to me, but it is on everybody's mind. So I'm sure that the leaders of large healthcare systems are putting a lot of effort into this, and that our security is a concern they have. But I don't want to presuppose that the information that's already out there, for example, if if you take a prescription medicine, you know, there's a lot of transaction history so your credit card company knows it, the pharmacy knows it, your doctor's medical record system knows it. I don't think that's as secure as one might think. Now, is it of high value to cyber thieves? I don't know. But I think there's significant potential for that information to leak out. And I think that's just something people have to be ready for, because there are significant handoffs of those fields of information that happen every day for each and every one of us. So it's a huge issue. It will, I'm sure, create an entire new industry that focuses just on that. And I know of a few, actually a few people in my community here that are employed by the cybersecurity industry, and it seems to be a vibrant one.
Absolutely, thank you very much.
And the question I wanted to bring up, just like Anthony, thank you very much for coming on. Very much appreciate it. I wanted to pick your brain about necessity and development. So some of our greatest technological advances, as you know, have come out of necessity. One thinks of nuclear weaponry in World War II, landing on the moon and the space race and the Cold War, and most recently the COVID vaccine in only a 9-month turnaround. So I guess I wanted to ask you, what do you think that next necessity is going to be? At the risk of speculation, you know, what could be that next thing that forces us to sort of get into gear and develop new technology? Is it the obesity epidemic? Is it climate change? Or what's your perspective?
I think one of the key things, and I spoke earlier in the podcast about the resource constraints we're going to run into with if all the things that we're doing today actually work. I think the production of healthy food on this planet is a big crisis waiting to happen. The last thing you want, you brought up obesity, which has many causes, but it's pretty clear that, and I heard this said at a course I took a long time ago, the worst thing that can happen to this planet is for the rest of the planet to consume like Americans, because there's just not enough food on the planet for that math to actually clear. And so how do we solve that? It's hard enough to get us to come down. That would be one possible way to do it. That doesn't seem to be on too many people's minds. Although I think the dietary habits of major parts of the population have evolved in a positive way. But nonetheless, plenty of people are still going hungry. And so how do you solve for that? And how do you produce enough nutrition for the rest of the planet to live a comfortable life? That's a manufacturing challenge, and the US is blessed with a relatively low density of population and a very rich density of farmland. And so that's helped us for generations and is helping us be a net exporter of food. But how long can that last becomes the question. And how can you supplement the production capacity in a way that allows for your grandchildren to enjoy the same quality of life that we enjoy today? And so that's a major concern. And one that is going to be interesting one to solve both from an industrial perspective. So private capital and private innovation will play a role here in terms of developing new technologies that increase yield. But also governments will have to really start diverting resources to answering this question, as opposed to trying to solve the symptoms of it, right? But at the beginning of it all was of this great human race was a steady supply of food.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have that, you can start to make plans and continue to live in a certain type of activity. If you don't have that, all bets are off.
Very true. Thank you very much. I appreciate the answer.
It is healthcare at its core, because a person that is malnourished cannot be healthy. But it's much bigger than healthcare.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you for answering these questions, Paul. And as I've been reflecting upon the discussion today, we touched on a few topics. We talked about the innovation, the nature of innovation, and the rate of innovation in the health technology industry, which was great. But if I were to talk about a key takeaway I'm taking from this conversation is a very new way of thinking about the thesis that we laid out, which is the capacity constraint model. And looking at how everything can almost be brought down to the level of demand and supply question. And then, you could try to seek scenarios and then the answers can begin to appear from that perspective. Just now we talked about how capacity will be constrained on planet Earth from food perspective, and how that might actually be the fifth industrial revolution. And then that goes to, making life better on planet Earth. So very, very interesting and a good way of, applying the basic principles of economics to the problem that we're trying to solve. And we will investigate this framework a lot further. With that, thank you for your time today. Anything else that you would like to say to us and to our audience?
Thank you for inviting me. Hopefully this provides for a little bit of reflection for your audience and your students. And I look forward to seeing you soon, Ruchin.
Yes, same here. Thank you, Paul.
And very nice to meet two of your students.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll end the recording now. That was a very enlightening discussion we had today with Mr. Paul Fonteyne. While we started to talk about health technology, I think where we ended is really a different way to look at the thesis that we have proposed, and it is a capacity constraint model, and how decisions are made based on capacity that is required to sustain human life. And in that context, all scenarios, the scenario of making life better on Earth by investing in technologies that enable us to do that is very plausible, and that will be the near-term fifth industrial revolution. The idea of going into space, initially to outsource activities that allow us to sustain life on Earth, and then maybe in the future to escape planet Earth. Absolutely a plausible scenario in that context, again, from a capacity model perspective. And also that health technology is actually may not be the revolution, but maybe the driver of all of these scenarios, because what it is really driving is human longevity. And with human longevity comes the fact that you have to sustain human life in meaningful ways, from nutrition perspective, from health perspective, from energy perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So a very, very interesting discussion. Also behooves us to really think about having some discussions with economists on this supply and demand model that we have talked about today, and look for some more of those kind of discussions in the future. With that, thank you so much for listening in, and we'll be back with a lot more interesting content as we build upon this project. Thank you so much. And thank you, Tillman. Thank you, Anthony, for your support.